National currencies are really a tool used by the government and the financial sector to leech away your time and your freedom by stealing your purchasing power. So rather than storing your economic energy, currencies leak.
Hello everyone, welcome to my channel Anarchy for Freedom, India's home for conspiracy research and free thinking. If you're finding your way to this channel and you're new here, please hit the bell icon and subscribe to my channel so I can reach you directly. Also, I don't want to rely too much on YouTube because the content that I'm covering here is a little controversial. So if you can, please subscribe to my email list. I've linked it in the description down below so I can reach you directly. And also check out my website anarchyforfreedom.in to stay updated with all the work that I'm doing right now. In today's video, I'd like to explain to you about the concept of how the money that we use today actually comes into existence. And it might not be in line with a lot of people's understanding of how that takes place because of how we're taught that concept in school and how we're discouraged to sort of look into the real origins of money and understand where it's really coming from. This video is a continuation of my understanding and presentation of Agenda 21. So if you want to get the maximum value out of this video, please go and watch my prior video that I did before this one, titled UN Agenda 21 in India, the Illuminati Plan for World Domination. Before we get an understanding of how money is created today and how we trade and exchange value in society in the current context, it won't be really meaningful unless we get an understanding of where we've come from, in the sense of what our past is, what were we doing in the past when it came to money and when it came to trade, and where do we stand in contrast to that in the present today. And to get an understanding of the past, we really have to start with the origins of civilization and the cradle of civilization itself, which is Sumer, Egypt, that area of the world, wherein people would largely get around by the use of barter. And I'm sure you all are familiar with what barter is. And the main problem with barter was something a lot of economists have termed the coincidence of wants, wherein if I have a cow and you have grains, and I want that exchange to happen when I want the grains instead of giving you the cow, then I need to find someone who wants my cow, and I also need to find someone who has the grains to give me instead of taking a cow in return. And I also have to find someone who wants that thing at the same time as I do. Because of these limitations, barter kept society quite primitive and stopped an expansion of trade and prosperity from happening because of the reasons that I just stated. People got around the limitations of barter by starting to use common goods instead of having to exchange one good instead of the other. So people would use things like salt, things like sugar, things like seashells, that kind of thing. But even those had a lot of limitations built into them. And this was until the people at large found the ultimate sound money that has stood the test of time throughout history, which is gold and silver. And initially, they started out not fulfilling all the functions of money because people would take gold and silver and they would have to weigh them by weight, and it would be sort of a guess and estimation game as to how much you would get back in return. And this concept fully changed with Lydia and the invention of the first sound money, the true money of history, which was uniform gold coins and silver coins. Once these gold and silver coins were created in Lydia, the use sprang up, but it wasn't until they made their way to one of the biggest and greatest civilizations of history in Athens, Greece, where the free market money really found home and helped to build one of the most prosperous nations that has ever existed on the face of the planet. And this is a really interesting story because although gold and silver coins were really instrumental in helping Athens become the superpower and the giant that it was ultimately the problems that we have in the banking system today which led to its demise. And this is a really interesting story that I'd like to share with you all, some of which can be explained in this video that I'm going to play right here.
They started debasing their coinage to pay for the war. If you take in 1,000 coins in taxes, and then you melt those down, those gold coins, and you mix 50% copper into your gold, now you can mint 2,000 coins. So if you take in only 1,000 coins, but you spend 2,000 coins, what is that called? That is deficit spending. Athens began to do that during this war with Sparta. They also had these great public works, which were very expensive, and they finished the Temple of Athena Nike during the truce in the middle. There was a 6-year truce in the middle of this 27-year war. So they didn't stop their great public works and allow their market economy to heal from the expense of this war. As they debased their coinage, people would take the new debased coins at face value at first, until there were a whole bunch of those. And there's something called Gresham's Law, where people tend to save to keep the thing that's rare, and they spend the thing that's common into circulation first. So all of the gold and silver coins started to disappear from circulation and become quite rare, and it was just these copper coins. Suddenly, it took a whole bunch of copper coins to buy a gold or silver coin, one of those old gold or silver coins. This is the first time that gold or silver ever had a price. Before that, everything was measured in a weight of gold and silver. So a large factor in Athens' downfall was the expense of war, the expansion of empire, the debasement of their currency, the eventual inflation that was caused. They minted these coins until they became nothing but flecks of copper. This was actually the world's first hyperinflation. And what it did was it financially debilitated Athens to the point where in 404 BC they surrendered to Sparta. And eventually they became nothing but a satellite of Rome.
As you can see, it was ultimately the inflation of the money supply by diluting the gold coins with a copper content that led to runaway inflation, which ultimately made Athens surrender to Sparta. Another really striking example that history shows us when it comes to money is the Yap Island, where people used a currency called rye stones, which were these massive giant circular discs with holes in the center, which would be considered as money by those people who were living in their island, because those stones were very difficult to produce and they were hard to bring into existence as new money. And people wouldn't really move those stones around, but their title of ownership would be transferred from person to person when any buying or selling would take place. I'd now like to read you a passage from Saifdean Ammous' book, The Bitcoin Standard, about these rye stones and what was the fate of these islanders later on. For centuries and possibly even millennia, this monetary system worked well for the Yaps. While the stones never moved, they had salability across space, as one could use them for payment anywhere on the island. The different sizes of the different stones provided some degree of salability across scales, as did the possibility of paying with fractions of a single stone. The stone's salability across time was assured for centuries by the difficulty and high cost of acquiring new stones. Because they didn't exist in Yap, and quarrying and shipping them from Palau was not easy. The very high cost of procuring new stones to Yap meant that the existing supply of stones was always far larger than whatever new supply could be produced at a given period of time, making it prudent to accept as a form of payment. In other words, the rye stones had a very high stock to flow ratio, and no matter how desirable they were, it was not easy for anyone to inflate the supply of stones by bringing in new rocks, or at least that was the case until 1871, when an Irish-American captain by the name of David Icke was shipwrecked on the shores of Yap and revived by the locals. O'Keefe saw a profit opportunity in taking coconuts from the island and selling them to producers of coconut oil. But he had no means to entice the locals to work for him. Because they were very content with their lives as they were, in their tropical paradise and had no use for whatever forms of foreign money he could offer to them. But O'Keefe wouldn't take no for an answer. He sailed to Hong Kong, procured a large boat and explosives, took them to Palau, where he used the explosives and modern tools to quarry several large dry stones, and set sail to Yap to present the stones to the locals as payment for coconuts. Contrary to what O'Keefe expected, the villagers were not keen on receiving his stones, and the village chief banned his townsfolk from working for the stones, decreeing that O'Keefe's stones were not of value because they were gathered too easily. Only the stones quarried traditionally with the sweat and blood of the Yappies were to be accepted in Yap. Others on the island disagreed, and they did supply O'Keefe with the coconuts he sought. This resulted in conflict on the island, and in time the demise of the rice stones as money. Today the stones serve a more ceremonial and cultural role on the island, and modern government money is the most commonly used monetary medium. As we can see in both the examples I gave you here, whether it was Athens or whether it was the Yappies of Yap Island, both the people in those places who decided to save the wealth that they earned through the time and energy into those currencies could have their savings stolen from whoever could increase more of that currency that was in use and supply. Which means that in the example of Athens, when people worked and saved their money and energy in the currency of the Athens government, and the Athens government basically diluted the currency and introduced more copper, which was more easy to create, so they could create more money than they would be able to if it were gold. That's what led to the population's savings being stolen from them and being transferred to the people who created the new money. And it was the same in the case of the Yappies of Yap Island, because they thought that the money was really difficult to create and no one would take the effort to go to Palau and bring new money. But when someone from outside the island actually did that, it led to the demise of the currency, because the person known as James O'Keefe, who actually went and used the explosives and created more rice stones, he was able to get them in Yap Island, and the people over there had a conflict over whether to accept that money or whether to reject it, and that's what eventually led to the demise of the currency. And also the people who must have saved in that currency would have lost their purchasing power, because from that point on, anyone could create more rice stones and bring them into the island and use those stones to buy real things and services from there. What money really is a store for your time and energy that you wish to deploy at a future point in time. In the sense that if you are a mechanic and you provide that service to someone and they give you the value, the money in return, then that money is really a representation of the time and energy that you put in for that person, which you can deploy at some future point in time and use it to store that energy around. It's important to note here that there's a fundamental difference between money and currency. The properties of currency are the following. It should be a medium of exchange, it should be a unit of account, it should be portable, it should be divisible, it should be durable, and it should be fungible. Money, on the other hand, also requires a seventh property, which is that it needs to be a store of value. It needs to preserve your purchasing power over a long period of time. If you go by these definitions, what we have in the world today in terms of government printed fiat currencies is exactly that, currencies, because they're not stores of value, and simply by their nature of having no limits on their creation, they are inflationary and they don't preserve your purchasing power over a long period of time. In fact, if you see even year to year, the amount of things you'll be able to buy with a certain amount of money this year will be more than what you'll be able to buy next year with the same amount of money. So there's a big difference between fiat currency and actual money. The difference being that money actually preserves your purchasing power and acts as a store of value, when fiat currency doesn't. And you only need to look into the history of fiat currencies to see that every single one of them, literally every single government created paper currency that has existed on the planet till this day has gone to zero without exception.
Catalog all of the fiat currencies throughout history and what happened to each of them. Addison dutifully went to work. Within a short period of time, he had gone through the alphabet All the fiat currencies that started with the letter A were done. They all went to zero. He was halfway through the letter B, and all the fiat currencies that started with the letter B, and there were 600 of them in just the first letter and a half of the alphabet, and every single one of them went to zero. Every one. 600 fiat currencies that start with the letter A, and half of the ones that start with the letter B are 600 of these things. Not one ever came close. You think this one, the United States dollar, is going to be the first one after all that? I don't think so. No currency, fiat currency has ever survived. None.
When it comes to fiat currencies, empires in the past have always followed this pattern, wherein they start off with quality money, which is gold, and a currency backed by that, to eventually evolving towards a point where it's only the currency that's left and the gold has been not linked to it anymore. And this progression happens in the way that I'm going to describe now, which is that they basically start off with taking taxes and spending as much as they're receiving. But at some point in time, when the nation grows more prosperous and they become more confident about themselves, they start to do deficit spending, wherein they start to spend more than what they have by taking debt. And this is not possible if those empires are only using gold fully back to the currency that they're using. So they have to print more currency than there is gold to back it up. And this results in inflation. And this inflationary creation ultimately goes towards building a better military, making the empire look strong, and those kinds of things. And after a point in time, the money creation just goes berserk and they print more and more and more money than they actually have. And this results in this kind of inflationary scenario wherein the prices rise dramatically and the people of the nation lose faith in that currency. And there is an eventual return back to sound money, which is gold and silver and those kinds of things, wherein the population uses its worthless currency now because the government just inflated it out of existence. And they rush to gold and silver, and then gold and silver land up accounting for the amount of inflation that the government of the empire, in this case, caused to that currency.
The 7 stages of empire, just as a reminder, started with sound money. And then a country adds layers of public works and social programs, and then develops a massive military, and then puts that military to use. And to pay for the war, it debases its currency supply, which causes a loss of faith in the currency, which then leads to a currency crisis, and gold does an accounting of the expansion of that fiat currency supply that happened over all those years of the first 5 stages. We are in the 6th and beginning the 7th stage. Gold started the accounting in the year 2001. It was $250 then, but we're still in the very early stages of this.
It's really naive to me to think that the entire history of money and currencies, every single fiat currency has gone to zero. But we somehow land up thinking that, oh, it's the dollar, or it's the rupee, or it's, whatever currencies we have today, and it won't happen this time. But I mean, people are really wrong if they were to think like that, because all nations and all empires in the past have gone through the same cycle, and we are at the end stage of that cycle currently, that I believe. And it's not even just past empires. You can look at more recent examples like the Zimbabwean currency and what happened to Germany around World War I, that period, and they had a hyperinflation of their currency as well. So this is not something that's excluded only to the past. I mean, we are following the footsteps of empires that have existed in the past, and we will reap the same returns. Inflation and the resulting hyperinflation are nothing but fancy terms for hidden taxes, wherein the people or the groups or the organizations like central banks that have the power to create more money can steal from the productive people in society, like those who have saved after they have contributed something to society. And the inflation over the years and essential hyperinflation lands up stealing value from those who are saving in the said currency, and it transfers it to the people who print the currency and who use it first. At some point in recent history, people who are using gold as money started to go and deposit their money in institutions that would safeguard it from them because they didn't want to keep the gold due to risk of theft and other reasons. So they would go and deposit this money with this institution, and the institution would give them a sort of check in return or a note which said that this is a representation that you have this much gold with us at the vault. And this is where these people really came up with the idea that not everyone comes and asks for the gold at the same time. So what they started to do is they used to issue more receipts or notes than they actually had gold in deposit. And when the people started to figure this out, that the bank, or sorry, not the bank, but the vault in that time was issuing more money than they had gold, people started going and asking for the gold back. And when everyone went and asked for their gold back, they didn't have enough gold to actually give those people because they had given it out on loan somewhere else. If we were to fast forward a little bit to the last 200 years of monetary history, after 1873, most governments of the world had a gold-backed currency, wherein the currencies that were issued by these governments and the central banks were fully redeemable to gold. Meaning, if you took the currency note that you had, which you worked for, and you went to the banks and you said, I want my gold, they will give you the full amount of gold of that currency back to you. And if we start to see how this progressed, the first gold backing that these countries start out with is always like the first step of the scam, because from that point on they unlink the currencies eventually and then start to inflate the currency, which is the notes, more than the amount of gold that they have. And this is the same thing that happened in these last 150 years. So if we start to see the evolution of this, around World War I time, the full redeemability of these notes to gold in a lot of countries went to partial redeemability, wherein if I walked into a bank with a $50 note, I would only get $20 worth of gold back. And this sort of went on until the end of World War II. And during this whole time, America was exporting consumer goods to the nations which were mainly involved in these wars, and they were getting a lot of gold back in return. By this point, America had accumulated around 2/3 of the entire world's gold supply. And if things continued that way, due to the lack of gold available with other nations, the entire monetary system would collapse, which, along with a few other things, led to the formation of the Bretton Woods system to bring some sort of financial stability to the world order, wherein a lot of nations agreed that the US dollar would become a reserve currency pegged to all the other currencies in the world, and that the US dollar would be fully redeemable to gold. And this sort of got a lot of trade going in the economy in the world, and it got things back to kind of normal. And from that point on, America actually started doing deficit spending. It started printing more dollars than it had gold to actually back them up, to finance the Vietnam War effort and certain other things. And nations started to get a suspicion of this, with the example of French President Charles de Gaulle, who gave this speech when he spoke about his doubts on America actually having the gold to pay back the nations that it's giving the dollars to.
Le fait que beaucoup d'États acceptent par principe des dollars au même titre que de l'or pour les règlements des différences qui existent à leur profit dans la balance des paiements américaine, ce fait entraîne les Américains à s'endetter, et à s'endetter gratuitement vis-à-vis de l'étranger, car ce qu'ils lui doivent, ils le lui payent, tout au moins en partie, avec des dollars qu'il ne tient qu'à eux d'émettre, étant donné les conséquences que pourrait avoir une crise qui surviendrait dans un pareil domaine, nous pensons qu'il faut prendre à temps les moyens de l'éviter. Nous estimons nécessaire que les échanges internationaux soient établis, comme c'était le cas avant les grands malheurs du monde, sur une base monétaire indiscutable et qui ne porte la marque d'aucun pays en particulier. Quelle base? En vérité, on ne voit pas qu'il puisse y avoir réellement de critères, d'étalons autres que l'or.
Ultimately, many countries started figuring this out and started redeeming the dollars to America in exchange for gold in return. And from around 1959 to 1971, there was a big fleet of gold from America to these other nations. And at some point, America had to realize that if it continued giving gold in exchange for dollars, the entire monetary system would collapse because there wasn't enough gold to give in exchange for all the dollars that had been created. So in 1971, President Nixon announced that the US would be going off the gold standard. And from that point in time, gold has never had anything to do with the dollar or been linked to the dollar in any way.
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
So this is what we have today, literally. We have all these governments and their currencies which are pegged to the US dollar, which is not pegged to anything. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of governments like Russia, China, Iran, Libya have had their attempts over the last few years to do bilateral trades wherein they bypass the dollar and exchange goods and services in their own currencies or in gold, or there have been attempts to start certain gold-backed currencies like Libya's gold-backed dinar, but we all know what happened to Libya and Gaddafi because of one of the reasons being that they wanted to do this. If we can take one key point from looking at the history of money and civilization, it is that sound money, which is essentially money that can't be created easily compared to other things, acts as a check on government power. It stops governments from using money more than what they actually get from their citizens. And this is why most governments today and most governments of the past have hated gold and hated fully having the currencies redeemable to gold, because those governments can't use more money than they have to achieve their goals and their motives. It is bad enough already that the governments today are depriving us of sound money and they're forcing us to use a currency that they control and they can easily increase through legal tender laws. And this would be bad enough if it weren't for this whole other aspect of information which concerns with how money actually gets created today, which is a really big scam in and of itself, which we will explore now together. If I were to go to a popular spot in Mumbai today and ask a lot of people randomly, tell me how money is created, the most common response I would get is that, oh, the government prints it, or something on those lines. But this isn't accurate at all. If we actually start to go into how money gets created today, a lot of people would be shocked and surprised with what they would find out. The entire cycle can be explained like this. It all starts with a politician who comes up and says, vote for me and I'll give you more free money than my opponent who is contesting. And when this politician goes into power, it results in a lot of deficit spending, meaning the government uses more money than it actually has via issuing bonds, which are nothing but IOU instruments, wherein the government gives a promise to pay whoever will fund it and buy the bond at that point in time. So let's say the government issues a bond for 1 billion rupees with an interest rate of 8%, which means that for someone who were to buy that bond, they would give the government 1 billion rupees and the government would pay it 8% interest every year. And these bonds are mainly bought by big banks and insurance companies, some insurance companies and some small individual traders otherwise, but they're mainly bought by the commercial banks, and even a lot of the public sector banks buy bonds. These bonds that get purchased by the banks and fund the government's debt eventually get bought by the RBI in this case. And the RBI will buy the bonds from the banks and other people who have bought it from the government, and they will literally create money out of thin air, meaning they will write the banks a check, which is, if anyone else did it, the check would bounce. But it's the RBI, so this is how the base money, the currency notes that we use today, most of them, if not all, get created by this process, wherein the RBI steps in, they buy the government debt from the commercial banks who have bought it, and in exchange, they give them freshly created money, which the RBI just created out of nothing. This process results in a buildup of government debt with the RBI and money that the treasury of the government receives from the banks who have bought the government debt. And then this new money that's created goes through the government. It gets used by the government to do all the things that the government said it would do. People end up receiving that money, and then the next step is that these people who receive the money would go and deposit it in the banks, or if they've already received it in the banks, it's the same thing. Now, this is where it gets seriously bizarre. When we go and deposit the money that we earn into a bank account, what we are doing is we are loaning the bank our money. And despite some few regulatory hurdles that the banks have, they can actually do whatever they want with your money. They can gamble it away in the stock market, or they can loan it out to other people as they do. And what happens when you go and deposit your money in your bank is that the bank is only required to keep around 10% of the money in reserve. It's 10% for most Western countries. In India, they have something called the cash reserve ratio and the statutory liquidity ratio, which the RBI sets, and that basically they have like academic jargon for saying that the banks are required to keep this much amount of the loans that they receive from the public, the deposits essentially, on reserve. And what these banks do is, it would be criminal if anyone of us did it, but what they do is, when they receive that deposit from you, say it's 10,000 rupees, and if they're required to keep 10% aside, so they would keep 1,000 rupees aside, and they can literally give 9,000 rupees as a new loan to someone else. Now, if you don't understand why this is bizarre, like, go a step back and think about this, because the 10,000 rupees that, say, I gave to the bank still show in my account, but the bank has gone and given 9,000 of the 10,000 to someone else as a loan. So the bank literally creates the 9,000 out of nothing, because I have the 10,000 and the person who got the 9,000 also has the 9,000. So this is how most of the money in the economy is created actually. And if you follow this process through, the person who gets the 9,000 rupees as a loan will obviously spend it on something, and that money will get deposited in a bank account. The bank will then keep 10% of 9,000 on deposit, and then probably lend 810 rupees, 8,100 to someone else. That will get deposited again, and then they will keep 10% aside and again lend out the remainder. And if you actually follow this whole thing through, if the reserve requirements are 10%, then these commercial banks, not the RBI, but the commercial banks of the country and even the public sector banks, they can create 10 times more money than actually was created by the RBI. And most of the money that is there, around 92 to 96% of the money that is created today, comes into existence in this way. The scam is called fractional reserve banking, and in this scam, the banks literally get to create money out of nothing, and they have the audacity to charge people interest on it.
It turns out that banks actually have about 9 times as much money loaned out as they have on reserve in their vaults. This is possible because of what's referred to as fractional reserve lending. The way it works is that the Federal Reserve, or the central bank in any country, is legally allowed to determine the amount a bank must have on reserve. In the US, it's currently around 10%. So if you deposit $10,000 into the bank sets aside 10%, or $1,000, and then loans out the rest of your money. The way it works is, say another person comes into the bank and asks for a car loan of $9,000. At this moment, the bank loans out the $9,000 from your original deposit. It isn't there anymore. The borrower then pays the person selling the car, and they go deposit the money into another bank, which is part of the same central banking system. This $9,000 is treated as a new deposit, and the process continues. The money gets redeposited and reloaned until the initial deposit of $10,000 becomes $100,000. The banking system just created $90,000 by loaning out your money.
This is how the global banking system and the people who own that banking system and created it have sucked the real wealth out of the world, because what they do is they use the governments to force people to use a currency that they can create through the banking system. And what they do is they create that money, which is like fresh air money. They just type it out into someone's account and it gets created by doing no work at all, not by actually getting that money from somewhere. They just get to give it from nothing. And when the people who get that money as a loan default on that loan, they get to take away real assets in exchange for money they just created out of nothing. So if I take a loan from a bank and the bank gives me 1 lakh rupees, which is just created out of nothing, and I'll end up defaulting on their loan, they will take away the collateral that I gave instead of the loan. They will take away my car. They will take away my house. So they actually get to take away real assets, real world physical assets, in exchange for money they could just effortlessly create out of nothing. And this is only possible because we continue to use their money and we save in their currency. And also the fact that the government mandates us to use the currency through legal tender laws. Don't bash yourself up too much if this totally blew you up and changed your notion for how you thought money was created. Because even people who've been in the system, who've been investment bankers, like this example I'm going to show you, had no idea about how money is created until they eventually stumbled upon it.
Well, I was working happily, making very good money at the time, doing what I really loved. I loved playing with numbers, and it was a fantastic job, great colleagues. My bosses always told me go out and spend more money on expensive restaurants. So I mean, everything was really, really great, and then all of a sudden, you know, you realize that you can be working for more than 25 years. I was a government bond trader, so I'm a specialist in government finances, and I didn't even realize how money was created. And it was not until a few years ago, when I was with a group of intellectuals, group of friends, and we were studying together and sharing ideas and so on. And they asked me how's money created, and I didn't know, and they knew, and I realized that it was the story, and I was the investment banker. I was supposed to know. So nobody should be ashamed, and I'm trying to tell a lot of people in Denmark how money is created. It's created out of thin air in the banks, not in the central banks. When I worked as a government bond trader, and my job was not to lose money, my job was to make money. When I realized that if I wanted to invest money according to how the central bank governors who decide the interest rates and the monetary policy should be working, then I lost money. But if I said, okay, what is the worst decision the central banks can do, and I presume that they would do that and invest accordingly, then I would make a lot of money. So I learned by having to make money, otherwise I would lose my job. I realized that central bank governors very often did the opposite of what was good for the society. And then I looked into the IMF, and just the whole concept of lending money at 10% interest to a country that is in deep trouble. There's something really dodgy going on there, right? And then if you take one country and it goes horribly wrong and all the assets end up on multinational corporations and with a few military bases for America and so on, fine, okay, once maybe. But when it happens every single time, then you gotta be yeah, I don't want to say any silly thing, but you know, it cannot be a coincidence when it happens in every single country where the IMF goes in and the World Bank goes in. The country gets borrows some money from IMF with a high interest rate, and then they can't pay that. The IMF says, okay, so we can lend you a little bit more money, but you have to cut the public sector, you have to fire everybody, unemployment goes up, nobody can pay taxes, then they lose even more money, and then they say, okay, now you have to privatize all your assets. And then obviously the equity market has already dumped 60 or 70%, so the prices they can get are very low. And then here comes the multinational corporations in and buys everything up on the cheap. It's gangsters. They are bankster gangsters, basically. And I started talking about that more and more. I had a dinner with Janet Yellen, the former chairwoman of Federal Reserve, and about 14 other traders. I didn't know we were colleagues. I thought she was a public employee not doing a proper job. So I was grilling her like you couldn't believe it. And I was working at Morgan Stanley at the time. I had made my year's budget already in April, and I lost my job 3 weeks after the dinner. I've never in my entire life heard of a trader who lost his job when he had made his year's budget in 4 months. I've never heard about that, ever. But that happened. It could be a coincidence, but I think that's why, because I was really giving her a hard time. Had I known we were colleagues, I would have been a bit more of a gentleman. I would have treated her, and then I could make up my mind, okay, I don't want to be a colleague with a person who's doing like that. But I didn't know Federal Reserve was privately owned. I didn't know.
So ultimately, we work hard for the money that we receive. We spend our time and energy, and we choose to save that time and energy in their worthless paper currency. And the government comes and taxes us on the money that we earn. This tax money goes to the treasury, and a big part of this tax money will go to pay the interest on the government bonds which the government created. Now get this, a lot of the interest on the debt that we are paying is being paid by the government to the people who own the bonds. And like I had mentioned earlier, the RBI holds a large amount of bonds that the government has issued, and the RBI just bought them from nothing. Like, they just paid the government debt by creating money into existence, and we have to pay them interest on the money that they could just type it and create it. And this is where the tax money goes. This is where our tax money is being used to actually pay interest on the debt that is created from nothing. And the worst part is that the RBI, since it's government owned in India, it's not the same in places like America, but at least in India, it's owned by the government on paper. So the RBI at the end of the year transfers its profit and surplus back to the government. So the interest that we are paying on the debt gets paid back to the government because the RBI transfers the money that it receives through the interest on the bonds back to the government. And even for the other banks who buy the bonds from the government, as I explained in how fractional reserve lending works, even they get to buy a lot of the government debt from money they created out of nothing. The last part of the cycle is where the scam is really given away. If we see a lot of politicians, they talk about balancing the budget, they talk about spending within our means, but because of the inherent nature of how money gets created in our economy, it's impossible to do that. And let me explain this to you a little better with the help of an example. Let's say I'm the only person living on the planet today, and I borrowed 100 rupees from a bank, and I have to pay that 100 rupees off with 10 rupees interest, that's 10% interest. Where will I get that 10 rupees from? I can't get it unless I borrow another 100 rupees and then give 10 rupees from that as interest on it, and then I would have to again borrow some money to pay the interest on the new loan that I took. So you see how that goes. My point is, because of the way money gets created today, every single rupee that is in existence today has interest on it. And if you were to imagine a scenario where people were to start paying off their debt and we stop doing deficit spending, there would never ever be enough money available in the economy to pay back the debt, simply because when a bank makes a loan, it gives you the principal, but the interest component never gets created. So if we were to start paying off all the debt and reduce the deficit spending, the debt, as soon as it's paid, eliminates the principal amount. As in, the currency and the debt cancel each other out, and we're left with the interest. So if we were to pay back all the debt, we would literally suck out the whole money supply, and we would only be left with the interest to pay back, which would be impossible. It would be deflationary. It would suck all the money out of existence. And this is why the system would collapse in that scenario. And politicians don't want the system to collapse in the scenario, which is why they keep kicking the can down the road and they keep going more and more into debt, because it's the only way. When it comes to fiat currencies, the only way to survive is to borrow and borrow and borrow from the future to a point where either people default and a deep deflation sets in, and from that point we can go on and actually return to sound money, or they simply choose to inflate their way out of existence, where they keep borrowing money, and eventually they'll print so much money that the money becomes worthless and the prices of everything shoot up, and then the people rush to sound assets like gold and silver. I personally don't believe in government and authority, as I see it as illegitimate, and I don't think that moral people should support or believe in authority. And those reasons I explained in a video I did earlier called Why Indians Are Slaves Under the Government. But let's say even if you believed in government, you would ask this obvious question. If the government is taking debt, some part of the debt at least, from the RBI, which the government owns, and we have to work through our taxes to pay the interest on the debt, why can't they just make the debt interest free if they're creating it through the RBI, which they own? And this is the worst part. The more we do deficit spending, the more the government does deficit spending, the more bonds it creates, the more debt it takes, and the more taxes we have to pay off their interest on the debt. So at least we could make the situation a lot better if the government just sold bonds to the RBI, and the RBI, took them interest free, meaning they didn't demand any interest from the government. Let's see a short summary of this whole cycle that I explained in the video now.
Step 1. The government creates glorified IOUs. These bonds increase our national debt and put the public on the hook to pay it back. Step 2. IOUs are swapped to create currency. The Treasury sells the bonds to the banks. The banks then turn around and sell our national debt at a profit to the Federal Reserve, which they probably own. The Federal Reserve then opens its checkbook that doesn't have a penny in it and buys those IOUs with IOUs that it writes, checks, on a checking account that has a zero balance. Then they give those checks to the banks and currency just springs into existence, and then the whole process repeats. This results in a buildup of bonds at the Federal Reserve and currency at the Treasury, which is really just a supply of numbers. The Treasury then deposits the numbers in the various branches of the government, and we get to step 3. The government spends the numbers on promises, public works, social programs, and war. Then the government employees, contractors, and soldiers deposit their pay into the banks, and we get to step 4, where the banks multiply the numbers by magically inventing more IOUs through fractional reserve lending, where they steal a portion of everyone's deposit and lend it out. That currency gets redeposited, and then a portion is stolen again, and the process repeats over and over, magnifying the currency supply exponentially. Then we work for some of those numbers, which brings us to step 5, where our numbers are taxed. We pay tax to the IRS, who then turns our numbers over to the Treasury, so the Treasury can pay the principal plus the interest on bonds that were purchased by the Federal Reserve with a check from nothing. Then we get to step 6, the debt ceiling delusion. The system is designed to require ever-increasing levels of debt and will eventually collapse under its own weight because politicians always kick the can down the road. They don't want it to collapse on their watch.
So, all the money that exists today in the economy is created by banks simply typing it on a screen, whether it's the RBI or commercial banks, it's the same thing literally. And what we do when we choose to save the effort and the time that we spend in the government's currency is that we are benefiting those who get to create the new money and who get to spend it first. Imagine if you could counterfeit currency, you could create your own new currency like the banks do, and you got to spend it first. Who would it benefit the most? It would benefit you, because that extra money that you created has not yet been factored into the price of the product that you are buying. So, in the same way, in the current monetary system that we have, when the banks and the government create the money and use the money, they benefit the most because they are the ones who get to spend it first. And by the time that money sort of, exchanges hands and trickles down into the economy, the price of those products rise because of the new money that's chasing the lesser goods that exist. And this is what results in inflation for the rest of us. While the people who get to spend the money first don't have to buy the goods at a higher price. If we were to put all of this knowledge in the context of the global economy today, what we have is almost all governments on the world wherein they have currencies which have no peg to any sort of sound asset, or they're not backed by anything. And these governments over the last 20-30 years especially have just been creating new money and inflating their currency out of existence, whether it's the quantitative easing programs that have taken place by the Federal Reserve and the European Central Banks. A lot of banks in countries are going into negative interest rate territory, and these kinds of things are only going to get worse because Keynesian economics only has certain tools that it can use, and that is to increase the money supply and do things to spur demand, in their opinion, when they don't really do that. And this eventually is going to result in a crash of some sort of a massive scale, or much bigger than 2008, wherein it's going to involve the biggest wealth transfer that's going to take place from the people to the elite who get to create the money and control the currency supply. And we can benefit from this. I mean, it's bad enough, but if you position yourself on the right side of this equation by getting out of the garbage notes that you're holding, the rupees that can be created much more than the gold that's in existence by the central bank, then you get out of a currency that's about to be hyperinflated in the future, and you get into a currency which no one can make more of very easily, whose supply is very limited. And what will happen is, when this kind of event goes off, wherein most of the central banks in the world are just printing and printing and printing money until the money becomes worthless, eventually most of the money in the world will find its way to sound assets, whether it's gold or whether it's Bitcoin or whether it's assets that actually are deflationary, which can't be created by anyone. These will be the assets where most of the world value will rush in, and if you position yourself on that side, you'll get to benefit a lot in terms of monetary gains. In an event of a scenario like a global economic collapse taking place, exiting the fiat currency that we're using today and getting out into more sound money options will not just protect you from the inflation that's going to take place, but they will also protect you from the banks confiscating money. And again, this brings in the topic of bank bailouts and bank bail-ins, and it also ties into how governments and central banks all over the world and mega corporations want us to stop using cash and want us to start using more cashless options. And this has very sinister reasons if you tie it in with everything I explained in this video, because what they want to do is they want to trap all of our money in the banking system. And if you put this into context with how India works today, most major businesses get the biggest loans compared to what individuals like you and me would get. And the banks who are making these loans, most of the times they know that there is no way that this amount of money is going to get paid back. And then you have all these defaulters who land up exiting the country because of their connections and stuff. And then the banks lands up making up those losses which were incurred because these mega billionaires, because of their influence and connections, who got to escape from the country, they get to make up those losses from the depositors. And this is why, one of the reasons why, among many, governments and central banks are pushing for things to go cashless. and eventually they want to withdraw all cash from the economy and make everything totally cashless, which has big surveillance implications and also traps your money in the banking system. So let's say you have your life savings in a bank, and that bank has given out a huge amount of bad loans and is not able to recover them. They can literally steal the money from your account to prevent themselves from going bankrupt, literally. And there are laws like this now, like bail-in legislation, and they are absolutely present in the West, in Europe, and in America. But even in India, the controversial FRDI bill that was about to be passed, it got a lot of backlash because of this clause, and it's on the books for now. It's not really implemented, but they will try to push for it at some point in the future as well. And even without the FRDI legislation, we can see this with the example of what happened with PMC Bank right now. It's because it's the same thing I described, wherein the bank made a lot of bad loans and its books were bad, and then the RBI audited it. And the RBI literally ordered the bank to freeze all deposits and keep people from spending their own money. So what the RBI did is that if you had your life savings in that bank, RBI literally stopped you initially at the beginning stages of this from using most of the money except 1,000 rupees. And they literally stopped you from using your own money because your money was stuck in that bank. And imagine if this kind of situation happens with any other bank, the same thing would happen to you, which is why it makes understanding and implementing this knowledge in terms of real action very important, because God forbid any of us find ourselves in that situation, our life savings can be confiscated from us and stolen from us. And what will we do when there's no cash to exit the banking system? There is no escape. Your money is trapped, and if the bank goes bust, they can seize most of your money in your account, and under current regulations, they require to be insured by 1 lakh rupees, which is again insured by the RBI. In the event of this collapse, the global elite will use that scenario and that crisis in order to push for a new international economic order, which is what they've been striving for a really, really, really long time, which is a world government, a world central bank, a world army, and a total surveillance state, totalitarian control over the population of the entire planet. And this involves the creation of a global currency wherein all national currencies will be eliminated and it will be only cashless, and we will all be microchipped, and everything to do with us will be stored in that microchip, and we won't be able to get around in society without using that chip, and we can be turned off centrally, if we are deemed a threat to the government or something like that. I'd now like to read to you one of my favorite authors' books from the year 1995. His name is David Icke, and he wrote the following passage in his book, "And the Truth Shall Set You Free," back then. The elite want the introduction of a world central bank that would run the planet as the Federal Reserve now runs America. All banks and money flow would be controlled by the handful of people who would control the world central bank. The idea is to concentrate power into regional centers, as with the European Central Bank, and then fuse them together as one. The present World Bank and IMF would be absorbed into this centralized global financial dictatorship. In the same way, the proposed European currency is a stepping stone to the planned one world currency. The global currency is not intended to be physical money. It will be entirely credit, figures on a computer screen. The plan is to replace all paper money and coins and even credit cards with a barcode inserted under the skin of every human being. This barcoding would be programmed with all the details about us, including our financial assets. You would go into a shop and pay for the goods by holding the barcode, probably in your wrist, over the beam at a checkout. This will read the barcode, check that you have enough credit, and reprogram your under the skin bank statement to remove the amount you have just spent. This offers enormous potential for control. At present, if you go into a shop and the computer refuses a credit card, you can pay with cash. But what happens when cash no longer exists and the computer says no to your barcoding? You have no means to purchase anything. And naturally, those who campaign against the by then global fascist communist dictatorship will find that the computer doesn't want to know. Again, this book was written in 1995, and he predicted really accurately, along with a lot of other things if you read the book, where the world is today. And back then he was thought to be totally crazy, and still is today by a lot of people. But if we see what he was saying back then with what's happening in the world around us, it doesn't seem so crazy anymore, because we are so close to reaching the things that he described back then. This new global currency could also evolve from the IMF's SDR, which again is just money created out of thin air by the IMF. And this is where they want to take us. But the point I'm trying to make here is that we can choose a different direction in the case of that event happening and not fall for that trap. And we can return to sound money options. We can return to gold. We can return to amazing innovations like Bitcoin that exist today, which are deflationary, which are totally decentralized, and which have all the values of sound money and can help you protect your wealth and actually give you total ownership of your wealth in the digital realm as well. I'd now like to show you some relevant quotes from people and insiders who summarize the content of this video really well. The decrease in purchasing power incurred by holders of money due to inflation imparts gains to the issues of money, Federal Reserve. The issues of money in this case being the RBI, central bank in our country, and the entire banking system. Here's another quote by John Maynard Keynes. By this means, he's referring to fractional reserve banking, government may secretly and unobserved confiscate the wealth of the people, and not one man in a million will detect the theft. Here's another one by former Bank of England director Hosea Stamp. The modern banking system manufactures money out of nothing. The process is perhaps the most astounding piece of sleight of hand that was ever invented. Banking was conceived in inequity and born in sin. Bankers own the earth. Take it away from them, but leave them the power to create money and control credit, and with the flick of a pen, they will create enough money to buy it back again. Take this great power away from the bankers, and all the great fortunes like mine will disappear. And they ought to disappear, for this would be a better and happier world to live in. But if you wish to remain the slaves of bankers and pay the cost of your own slavery, let them continue to create money and control credit. Again, this was a former Bank of England director. Here's one by Henry Ford. It is well enough that people of the nation do not understand our banking and monetary system, for if they did, I believe there would be a revolution before tomorrow morning. And finally, here's one by the infamous Baron Nathan Mayer de Rothschild. I care not what puppet is placed on the throne of England to rule the British Empire, on which the sun never sets. The man that controls Britain's money supply controls the British Empire, and I control the British money supply. Here are excerpts from Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar's book, The Problem of the Rupee, Its Origin and Solution. When the standard of value is standard metallic money, the expansion cannot be very great, for the cost of production acts as a sufficient limiting influence. When a standard of value is convertible paper money, the provision that's to reserve act as a check on its expansion. But when a standard of value consists of a money, the value of which is greater than its cost and is inconvertible, the currency must be said to be fraught with the fatal facility of indefinite expansion, which is another name for depreciation or rise of prices. It cannot, therefore, be said that the Bank Charter Act made no improvement on the Bank Restriction Act. Indeed, it was a great improvement, for it substituted a currency less liable to expansion in place of a currency far more liable to expansion. Now the rupee is a debased coin, inconvertible and unlimited legal tender. As such, it belongs to that order of money which has inherent in it the potentiality of indefinite expansion, i.e. depreciation and rise of prices. As a safeguard against this, the better plan was no doubt the original one designed, namely of putting a limit on the issue of rupees, so as to make the Indian currency system analogous to the English system designed by the Bank Charter Act of 1844. If there is any force in the line of reasoning adopted above, then it is not easy to agree with the opinion entertained by the Chamberlain Commission of the Exchange Standard. Indeed, it raises the query whether, for all that the Commission said, there is not somewhere some weakness in the system likely to bring about its breakdown. It therefore becomes incumbent to examine the foundations of that standard from a fresh point of view. So you might be reading this and wondering, did Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar actually foresee the problems that we are facing right now with governments and the Indian government specifically having the ability to just indefinitely inflate the money? I think he did. In the next video that I'll be doing after this one, I'll be going more into the demonetization episode and a deeper explanation on the cashless society agenda and how it all ties into its surveillance implications and the loss of our freedoms. Please, if you like my content and you find this information valuable, all I want you to do is share it with other people and help them to wake up to this information so that they can safeguard themselves and their family, and we can all come together and bring an end to this insanity collectively. Thanks for watching. Take care.